There are wars that begin with a gunshot, and there are wars that begin long before any soldier fires a weapon, before the trench is filled with mud, steel, and bodies, before Europe collapsed under the weight of its own empires. The first irreversible decision of the First World War was made in silence. It was not made by generals studying maps, nor by presidents addressing their people, but by men who never wore uniforms, never marched, and never planned to die for the causes they would soon unleash. At the surface, history offers a reassuring explanation. The United States entered the war to defend freedom, to protect democracy, to answer a moral obligation when the world needed it most. It is a clean story, almost elegant in its simplicity, and it has been repeated so often that it feels unquestionable. But history has another voice, one that does not announce itself with speeches or monuments. It whispers, and it asks a far more dangerous question. What if America did not choose the war at all, but was slowly, quietly pushed into it? While Europe was bleeding itself dry, the United States stood apart, officially neutral, wealthy, confident, and convinced that distance meant safety. Yet far from the trenches, in rooms filled with polished wood and controlled smiles, enormous sums of money began to move. Loans were extended, guarantees were signed, and financial bets were placed on a single outcome. Long before the first American soldier set foot on European soil, neutrality had already been compromised on paper. By the time the call to arms reached the public, the decision was no longer moral or political. It was financial. Peace had become a threat. Defeat had become unthinkable. When a nation ties its future to the outcome of a war, war stops being a choice. It becomes a requirement, enforced not by ideology but by debt. And once money demands protection, blood inevitably follows. In the summer of 1914, the world still believed in illusions. Europe called itself civilized, rational, advanced, yet it rushed into war with the confidence of empires that had never truly imagined their own collapse. Old rivalries hardened into alliances, treaties snapped shut like traps, and millions of young men were pushed forward by flags, speeches, and the promise that the war would be short. By Christmas, they were told, it would all be over. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance. America was not bound by European blood feuds, not chained to ancient borders or dynastic pride. It was rich, industrial, expanding, and officially neutral. To the American public, the war looked like a tragedy, but also like someone else's mistake. The oceans felt wide enough to act as armor. Neutrality was not just a policy, it was an identity. Factories kept running, banks kept growing. While Europe burned resources at an unimaginable speed, America sold food, steel, fuel, and machinery to anyone who could pay. At first, this looked like opportunity without consequence, profit without commitment. War, after all, was happening far away. The United States could trade with the world without becoming part of its madness. But neutrality is fragile when money is involved. As the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, something subtle began to shift. The European powers were not just fighting with soldiers anymore. They were fighting with credit. Their gold reserves thinned, their economies strained, and their survival began to depend on one thing above all else: access to American capital. The war that was supposed to be brief turned into a grinding machine, and as Europe sank deeper into it, America stood at the edge, believing it could observe without being pulled in. History, however, rarely tolerates spectators for long. By 1915, the illusion of a short war was dead. Europe was no longer fighting for victory alone. It was fighting to stay solvent. Britain and France were burning through money as quickly as they were burning through men, and their treasuries could not keep pace with the demands of industrial warfare. Shells, rifles, ships, food, fuel, everything now had a price measured in millions, then billions. Gold began to vanish, reserves thinned, panic quietly crept into places the public never saw. This was the moment the war changed its nature. Not on the battlefield, but in the financial backrooms of the Atlantic world. Britain and France turned to the only place with both capital and capacity, the United States. American banks, once cautious, now faced a historic opportunity. Enormous loans were proposed, framed as temporary support, simple bridges until victory arrived. The risks were downplayed. After all, the Allies were expected to win. But money is never neutral. The moment American banks began extending massive credit to one side of the war, neutrality cracked. These loans were not abstract numbers. They were commitments that tied American financial stability to Allied survival. If Britain and France collapsed, the consequences would not stop in Europe. They would echo straight back into New York. At first, the sums seemed manageable. Then they exploded. What began as assistance turned into dependence. Entire supply chains reorganized around Allied demand, and American industry reshaped itself to feed a war it was not officially fighting. Quietly, invisibly, the United States crossed a line without announcing it. From that point forward, there was no such thing as standing aside. A bet had been placed, and the House could no longer afford to lose. The war had found its way into American balance sheets, and once that happened, the outcome of the conflict became a matter of domestic survival, not foreign concern. Once the flow of money began, it could not be contained. American banks did not merely lend. They reorganized the logic of neutrality itself. By financing Britain and France, the United States was no longer an observer supplying goods to both sides. It was a silent partner whose prosperity now depended on a single outcome. The longer the war dragged on, the deeper that dependence became. Factories across America shifted their priorities. Production schedules, shipping routes, and labor forces increasingly served Allied needs. Steel, ammunition, food, and fuel poured across the Atlantic, not as acts of charity, but as investments backed by credit. Every shipment reinforced the same reality. If the Allies failed, American lenders would face losses on a scale the country had never experienced. Meanwhile, trade with Germany shrank to almost nothing, officially restricted, unofficially discouraged. Neutrality still existed in speeches and legal language, but in practice, the economy had already chosen sides. Money had picked its camp, and politics was struggling to keep up. This imbalance created a dangerous trap. The more the United States lent and sold to the Allies, the harder it became to imagine a future without their victory. Financial exposure grew so large that peace itself became risky. A negotiated settlement or an Allied defeat would leave debts unpaid, industries destabilized, and confidence shattered. War, however horrific, began to look like the safer option. By this point, the United States did not need to be persuaded to care about the outcome of the conflict. It needed to be persuaded that intervention was inevitable. The nation had not marched into the war yet, but its economy was already fighting it. And when an entire financial system is invested in victory, neutrality becomes not just impossible, but dangerous. By the time the war entered its second brutal year, the trap was complete. The financial system that claimed to stand above the conflict was now inseparable from it. American banks were no longer simply exposed to the war's outcome. They were hostage to it. If Britain and France lost, the shock would not be limited to foreign defaults. It would ripple through Wall Street, collapse credit, destroy confidence, and drag the American economy into crisis. This is where the logic turned cold. The question was no longer whether the war was just or whether intervention was wise. The only question that mattered was survival. A modern financial system cannot absorb the failure of its largest debtors without consequences. At that scale, defaults become contagion. Panic spreads faster than armies ever could. Behind the language of neutrality, pressure began to build. not in public debates, but in private calculations. How long could the Allies hold out? How much more credit could be extended without guarantees? And most importantly, what would happen if the unthinkable occurred and they lost? In this moment, peace became a liability. Any outcome that stopped the war without a clear Allied victory threatened to leave enormous debts unpaid. The longer the conflict continued, the deeper the commitment became, and the more impossible it was to step back. War, paradoxically, started to feel like the only path that could protect the system that had financed it. This is the silent transformation most histories ignore. A nation that believes it is choosing whether to fight is very different from a nation that has already structured its economy around a single outcome. By 1916, the United States was no longer asking whether it should enter the war. It was slowly realizing that it might not be able to afford staying out. The moment of no return did not arrive as a single dramatic decision. It unfolded as a convergence of fear, pressure, and opportunity. By late 1916, the war had reached a deadlock that terrified financiers more than any battlefield defeat. The Allies were exhausted, drowning in debt, and running out of men. The system that depended on their victory was beginning to tremble. Publicly, the narrative shifted toward outrage and moral urgency. Newspapers grew louder, stories more selective, language sharper. Incidents at sea were no longer framed as distant tragedies, but as personal insults to American honor. Each headline narrowed the space for restraint. Each emotional appeal made neutrality feel less like prudence and more like cowardice. Privately, the calculations were brutally simple. Without American intervention, the balance could collapse. With intervention, the war might be decided and the debts secured. The machinery of opinion began to align with the machinery of finance. What looked like spontaneous public anger was, in reality, perfectly timed. When the United States finally crossed the line, it did so in the name of principle. Yet beneath the speeches and slogans lay a quieter truth. Entry into the war was not merely a response to provocation. It was a rescue operation for a system that had overcommitted itself. Intervention was the final insurance policy. From that moment on, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. But the cost of that certainty would be paid elsewhere, not by those who financed the conflict, but by those who would now be sent to fight it. When America entered the war, the distance between cause and consequence became impossible to ignore. Young men crossed the Atlantic into a landscape of mud, wire, and artillery, carrying ideals they barely understood into a conflict that had already consumed millions. They fought and died in fields whose names meant nothing to them, while the decisions that placed them there remained far away and unseen. Back home, the machinery of finance continued to function with remarkable stability. Contracts were fulfilled. Loans were protected. Balance sheets began to look safer with every mile the American army advanced. The war, now reframed as a moral crusade, achieved what the financial system needed most: momentum toward an Allied victory. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. In Europe, bodies filled trenches and hospitals overflowed. In New York, profits were recorded in ink. The suffering was physical and immediate for those at the front, abstract and distant for those who had structured the war in advance. The system did not feel pain. It only measured outcomes. As American involvement tipped the balance, the logic behind the intervention became clearer in hindsight. The war was no longer about preventing collapse. It was about ensuring dominance. Victory would not simply protect previous investments, it would reshape the global order in favor of those who had financed it. The soldiers paid the price of certainty. The lenders reaped the rewards of foresight. And in that imbalance, a new pattern of power quietly revealed itself, one that would define the century to come. When the war finally ended, the the devastation was almost impossible to comprehend. Europe emerged physically shattered, economically drained, and psychologically exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, entire generations were scarred, and the old empires that had once dominated the world stood weakened, burdened by debts they could barely service. Victory for them came at a staggering cost. Across the Atlantic, the picture was very different. The United States had suffered losses, but its homeland remained untouched, its factories intact, its financial system strengthened rather than broken. What mattered most, however, was not what America had lost, but what it had gained. The war transformed the country into the world's principal creditor almost overnight. Britain, once the financial heart of the global system, now owed vast sums to American lenders. France, drained of manpower and capital, faced the same reality. Power did not shift with speeches or treaties alone. It shifted through ledgers and repayment schedules. The center of gravity of the global economy moved west, quietly and decisively. This was not an accident of history. It was the logical outcome of a war, financed before it was fought. Then the nations that borrowed to survive emerged dependent. The nation that lent emerged dominant. Military victory sealed the transformation, but finance had prepared it long before the armistice was signed. The world spoke of peace, but a new hierarchy had already been established, and it was built not on battlefields but on debt. What followed was not simply the aftermath of a war, but the birth of a model. The conflict had revealed something powerful and deeply unsettling. Wars no longer needed to be fought first and financed later. They could be financed in advance, structured around credit, and locked into motion long before the public ever understood what was happening. This new logic changed everything. Debt became a form of control more effective than occupation. A nation that owed its survival to creditors could be defeated without being conquered, pressured without being invaded. The battlefield expanded beyond trenches and cities into interest rates, repayment schedules, and financial leverage. The tragedy is not that this model worked. It is that it worked so well. The system learned that once enough money was committed, political hesitation disappeared. Moral arguments became flexible. Public opinion could be shaped. And intervention, when it came, could always be framed as necessary, defensive, unavoidable. From that moment on, war was no longer just a clash of armies. It became a managed process, one where the outcome was increasingly determined by those who financed it rather than those who fought it. The First World War did not merely redraw borders, it rewrote the mechanics of power. And those mechanics did not vanish when the guns fell silent. They embedded themselves into the modern world, waiting for the next moment when money would once again demand protection. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it refuses to stay in the past. The mechanisms forged during the First World War did not disappear with the armistice. They survived, evolved, and learned. Today, wars are still explained with the language of necessity, security, and values, while the deeper structures that make them inevitable remain largely invisible. When financial systems grow large enough, they stop adapting to political decisions. Politics begins adapting to them. At that point, choices shrink. Intervention becomes framed as responsibility. Restraint is rebranded as weakness. And peace, once again, starts to look dangerously expensive. The lesson is not that bankers alone cause wars, nor that nations act without agency. It is more unsettling than that. It is that modern power operates through systems so vast that no single person appears responsible, even when the outcome is catastrophic. Money moves. Incentives align. And history follows. If the First World War teaches us anything, it is that the most decisive moments rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, in advance, while the world is still pretending that neutrality exists. So the question is not whether history will repeat itself. The question is whether we will recognize the pattern while there is still time to interrupt it.